Humanistic psychology was a movement that began in the 1960s and it possibly ended less than a decade later, and I want to look at that today. The term humanistic psychology sounds redundant. Of course, psychology is going to be concerned with humans. Why bother putting the word or the adjective human out in front of psychology? Well, in order to understand why it seemed important to do so in the 1960s, we have to look at the 1940s and 1950s. The practice of psychology, particularly in the United States, something different was going on in Europe, or there were different popular psychologies in Europe at that time. But in the United States, behaviorism was the theory that ran most psychology departments. Behaviorism was based on the idea that psychology could be a rigorous empirical science just like physics and biology and geology and sciences that depend on observation. And so behaviorists argued that the subject matter of psychology could be examined the exact same way. So just as we can take a rock and weigh it, get its mass through water displacement, get its volume, do a scratch test on it, see how hard it is, and apply all of these tests to it to get a sense of what the rock is made of, we can do the same thing with humans. And so if I can't see something as a psychologist, then it doesn't exist. So for example, if I'm thinking of something in my head and you try to guess what it is, unless you can actually see my thought, nothing's actually happening. Or at least nothing that can be studied by scientists. So behaviorists famously did tests on dogs and rats. Pigeons were popular because all of these animals behaved, and it was understood that if we can learn about behavior of dogs, then we can apply that to humans as well, and therefore understand humans. And so I want to talk about two examples of therapists or clinicians that became humanistic psychologists because they were disappointed in the therapies that were popular at their time. The first is Abraham Maslow, who studied at University of Wisconsin in Madison, and even back then it was a really famous and rigorous clinical psychology program. It still is today. But when he was a student there, he wasn't able to learn about human problems by interacting with humans. He had to interact with animals, and so it was an animal psychology program, and he was furious by this. He thought that he should be able to talk to other humans and understand suffering by examining human suffering, not by subjecting dogs to torture and then seeing how to possibly resolve the trauma that follows. And so when he left the department, he began looking at what ended up being like the farther reaches of human being. He looked at transpersonal psychology. He looked away from pathology or psychological problems or mental health disorders and towards flourishing. So like he opened up the entire the entire positive half of the spectrum. So it's not all just terrible things that psychologists are interested in. What about happy things or positive things, optimistic things? And so he can be credited, I think, he can be credited with the movement of positive psychology that became popular in the 90s with Martin Seligman and is still popular today. So that's just the first example. And so Abraham Maslow asked, where is the human in psychology? It's absent. All I see are dogs, pigeons, and rats. The second story is Carl Rogers, or the story of Carl Rogers. Now, Maslow and Rogers are two of the most famous, iconic names in this short, perhaps 10-year movement of humanistic psychology, and they had their perhaps most famous years, or the 1960s were their most famous decade in terms of publications. Fritz Perls was another one that published a lot during that time. And then like Kurt Goldstein, I think, passed away in the middle of that decade. But Rollo May, they were all, R.D. Laing, they were all writing at the same time. So it was, a lot of things were happening, a lot of really exciting things were happening. But then it kind of petered out in the 70s and stuff, but I'll talk about that in a little bit. So the second story is Carl Rogers. Carl Rogers became a therapist working in, I think it was a youth clinic, or primarily a children and youth clinic in upstate New York, and he was using methods that he thought to be successful or helpful at the time, useful at the time. And those were based on a cognitive therapeutic model. And so cognitive behavioral therapy is similar to behavioral therapy, but the cognitive part accepts that, yes, we do have thoughts and we can control those thoughts. And so cognitive therapists say things like, if you want to be happier, you need to start thinking more positively. Positive self-talk, like that sort of a thing. And you can control your emotions by thinking through them. And so it's kind of like mind over matter, if you will. And so Carl Rogers employed these methods with the children that he worked with, and then couples therapy, and then adult therapy. But he noticed, because he was such a good scholar and researcher, he didn't just do what he was supposed to do, be like, all right, check it off, I've successfully done therapy with these people. He would watch them and see how they did after they left. And so he was surprised one time after what seemed like a great therapeutic session, like, oh, we had such a great breakthrough, all the problems that you were experiencing you've resolved, and like, I'm so happy that like you're doing well. And then he watched this guy, like the next day, he just happened to be passing him on the street or seeing him outside when he was outside of his house, and it was the same kind of issue. And he asked him about it. He goes, oh, I guess I was just in a good headspace when I left, and now when I got back into my life, it's the same problems kind of cropped up. And Rogers realized that even though the therapy seemed successful, and he thought so, and the patient thought so, or the client thought so, it really wasn't. And so he began throwing away all of the rules he had learned, how to be a good therapist. And he had a radical idea, and few people would have the courage to do this. He said, I don't know what people need, or I don't know what constitutes help. In fact, I don't know that I can help you. Who would possibly come up with that idea, being a professional psychologist? I don't know how to help people. But he began going into therapy sessions with that mindset, or in group therapy with that mindset, saying, I'm not sure I can do anything for you, but I want to see if I can understand your problems. And if that is productive, great. If not, then maybe we can work together and figure something out. And so that place of humility and courage became the foundation of his non-directive or person-centered psychotherapy, which is the hallmark of humanistic counseling. That the therapist doesn't come in with strategies to throw at the clients to fix them, but with a human person, a personality, right? They come in and say, I feel and I recognize and I notice, and you're feeling things too, and I seem to notice this, and having a real interaction. And that, he realized over time, by observing it, was helpful, was useful. He didn't know why, he couldn't make it happen, but it was the personality, the character of the therapist is what was most important, and the therapist had to be honest with themselves and actually listen to and try to understand the client. And so there were three principles of being present in that way that he would talk about. So anyway, we have Maslow, who wasn't interested in understanding animals. He wanted to understand humans. So let's have a human psychology. And then Carl Rogers, who took that almost a step further, saying we can't just be present. We have to be with our clients and not fixing them, but trying to understand them, being with them. And that alone is the productive part, or the useful part. So that is a short summary of what the movement was all about. There are three guiding premises, which I'll cover in a subsequent lecture. But right now, what I want to do is introduce humanistic psychology and then talk about whether or not it ended less than a decade later. So I mentioned the decade of the 1960s. The Journal of Humanistic Psychology was released in 1961, and so a lot of the names that I've mentioned were on that original editorial board. And in 1963, the Association of Humanistic Psychology was founded and began meeting regularly. And then by like 1965, Carl Rogers, the name that I mentioned earlier, the client-centered therapist, he realized this is about to end. Even though it had just started and there was a lot of excitement and enthusiasm, he said, we can't just be criticizing cognitive psychology and behaviorism. If that's all we accomplish, then we will end as soon as those two things evolve. And so once behavioristic psychology is no longer the mainstream method, there will be no reason for this group to convene if all we're doing is criticizing the behaviorists. And if all we're doing is offering an alternative to cognitive therapy, what happens when cognitive therapy, and so like the rational emotive therapy, once that evolves into a variety of cognitive therapies that have different uses, what will humanistic psychology be? And so Rogers actually predicted that humanistic psychology was in a decline by 1965. And if we look at the publications and novel, of course publications are still continuing, but the novel developments and theories and new excitement in humanistic psychology pretty much petered out in the 70s, certainly by the 80s, and then by the 90s, we start seeing things like positive psychology that wants nothing to do with humanistic psychology. Had positive psychology picked up where humanistic psychology left off and branded itself as a form of humanistic psychology, we may still see the movement. It could it could have carried the movement with it, but it wasn't the positive psychology's responsibility to keep humanistic psychology afloat. So what we have are meetings where people get together to talk about what happened in the 60s, which is really kind of disappointing. I'm going to talk about the three guiding premises in a subsequent lecture, but it's easy to pick out how each of them have been abandoned. And so the heart of humanistic psychology, which began with these criticisms of behaviorism and cognitive therapy, died.